That night I was working alone in the greenhouse, doing the usual checks, and I placed a plant right next to the door. But when I turned around a few seconds later, it was no longer there.
Story 1. I was working alone in the greenhouse that night, just doing the usual checks, and I placed a plant right next to the door, the clay pot with the white tag resting against the metal frame. The soil still damp from the last watering cycle, the leaves slightly glossy under the overhead lights. I turned away, walked a few steps down the path to adjust a valve. The sound of water shifting through the pipes, changing pitch, and when I looked back, the pot was no longer against the wall. It was in the middle of the path, perfectly centered, upright, facing forward, the white tag visible from a distance. I stopped, looked along the entire corridor, rows of plants on both sides, long rectangular beds filled with dense vegetation, glass panels above covered in condensation, drops sliding slowly down the surface, metal beams crossing overhead, no doors open, no movement. I walked back, nudged the pot with my foot, pushing it toward the wall again until it touched the frame. Then I stepped away without turning my back immediately, keeping it in view, the leaves still, no vibration, no shifting. I turned, took 10 steps, reached the valve, adjusted it again, and when I turned back a second time, the pot was once again in the center of the path, in the same position, straight, aligned with the corridor. I left it there and continued forward, moving deeper into the greenhouse, the temperature rising gradually, the air dense with humidity, the smell of wet soil and plant matter stronger as I passed each section, large leaves extending outward, some brushing lightly against my arms, others hanging lower. Forming partial barriers along the edges of the walkway, I reached the transition into the tropical section and stopped. The arrangement ahead was not the same. The spacing between the plants had changed. The path was narrower, the rows closer together, leaves overlapping from both sides, forming a tighter corridor. I stepped into it, moving slowly, the floor still wet, concrete, the central drainage line running forward, but the plants were positioned differently, larger stems leaning inward, smaller pots no longer aligned against the walls, several placed closer to the center, creating a loose sequence along the path. I followed that sequence, each pot spaced just enough to suggest a direction, the lights above flickering briefly, then stabilizing. Casting a steady pale glow over the leaves, I continued forward, passing sections that should have opened into wider areas. But instead, the plants formed continuous walls, dense, layered, no visible gaps. I turned back to check the entrance, and a hanging vine had shifted across the opening. Its length stretched from one side of the frame to the other. The leaves clustered together. Forming a barrier, I stepped back, reached out, and pushed it aside, the surface cold and damp, the vine resisting slightly before sliding away from the opening. I moved through and returned to the main corridor, but the alignment of the plants had changed again. More pots positioned toward the center, the path now defined by a clear line of containers, each one angled slightly inward, directing movement forward. I walked along that line without touching anything, the space between the plants narrowing further, branches extending overhead, forming an arch of overlapping leaves, the light filtering through them unevenly, creating darker patches along the ground. I lowered my head and passed under the arch, the air thicker in that section. The humidity higher, condensation forming on the metal supports and dripping onto the floor. I continued forward until I reached the area where the service exit should have been, but instead of a door, there was a dense wall of vegetation, stems and leaves layered tightly together, no visible handle, no frame, just plant matter filling the entire space. I stepped closer, examining the surface. And then the plants began to separate, slowly, each stem shifting aside just enough to create a narrow gap. then another, forming a straight passage, the leaves holding their new positions. The opening aligned perfectly, wide enough for one person. I stepped forward into the passage, the plants on both sides remaining still now, the path continuing in a straight line. Enclosed entirely by vegetation, no branches crossing it, no obstructions, just a narrow corridor leading deeper into the structure. I moved through it step by step, the light above dimmer in this section, the glass panels less visible, the metal beams further apart, until the corridor ended in a small enclosed room, the air inside cooler, dry, no condensation on the walls. The surfaces made of flat wooden panels arranged vertically, the lighting softer, coming from a single fixture above. In front of me there were rows of pressed plants, mounted between thin sheets, each one secured and labeled with a small white tag. I walked closer, examining them one by one. Different shapes, different textures, some broad and flat, others thin and elongated. All completely dry, their colors muted but preserved, the labels written in black ink, names, dates, reference numbers, aligned neatly beneath each specimen. I moved along the row slowly, reading each tag until I stopped in front of one that did not match the others. The shape was different, the lines too precise, too detailed. I leaned closer, and the surface showed a face, flattened and pressed into the sheet, the contours clear, eyes closed, mouth slightly open, the features exact, proportioned correctly, the texture smooth and dry, and just below it, on the white tag, there was a name written in clear black letters. It was my name, the same name printed on my uniform. I stood in front of it, looking at the sheet, the face remaining unchanged. The label fixed in place, I reached out and touched the edge. The surface rigid and cold, no moisture, no movement. I pulled my hand back, turned around, and the passage behind me was no longer open. The plants had closed again, forming a solid wall, stems and leaves pressed tightly together, no visible gaps, no openings. I walked along the perimeter of the room, checking each panel, each corner, but there was no other exit, only the rows of pressed specimens extending along the walls, each one labeled, each one fixed in place. I stepped back toward the center and looked again at the sheet with my name, the face still there, unchanged, the eyes closed, the mouth slightly open, the label clearly visible. The room silent, the air still, no sound except the faint echo of my own steps on the dry floor, and no way back through the greenhouse. Story 2. I worked the night shift as the only guard at a construction site on the edge of the city. The project stopped months earlier, the structure incomplete, exposed concrete columns rising through multiple levels, horizontal beams crossing above, sections of scaffolding attached to the outer walls, metal bars, and wooden planks forming loose platforms. I locked the main gate, walked across the gravel surface, small stones shifting under my shoes, and stepped inside through the open ground-level entrance. The air carried dust and wet cement, loose electrical cables hanging from the ceiling, temporary lights fixed to metal poles casting uneven illumination, shadows stretching between the columns. I walked through the first level, my steps echoing against the concrete floor, passing stacks of materials, wooden boards, bundles of rebar tied with wire, bags of cement hardened into irregular shapes, no movement. I reached the center of the structure when a metallic sound came from above, a short impact, followed by a brief vibration through the beams, the sound spreading across the open space. Reflecting against the concrete surfaces, I stopped and looked up. The scaffolding on the second level, empty, no figures, no shifting shadows. The sound stopped. I moved toward the metal staircase fixed along one side of the structure, placed my foot on the first step, and climbed slowly, the metal frame producing a dull echo with each step. Halfway up, Another sound came from above, longer this time, a dragging noise across a metal surface, steady for a few seconds. Before stopping, I reached the second level and stepped onto the platform. The surface covered with wooden planks secured with nails, some slightly uneven tools scattered across different sections, a hammer lying near the edge, a measuring tape extended across a beam, and a helmet resting on a horizontal metal bar at shoulder height, the helmet yellow, surface scratched in several places, thin lines across the top, dust settled along the edges, the strap tucked inside. I walked toward it, stopped a short distance away, then continued past it without touching it, moving along the platform, checking each section. No displaced materials, no footprints, no entry marks. I reached the far end, turned around, and walked back toward the staircase. And as I passed the same beam again, the metal bar was empty. I stopped and looked down. The helmet was now on the ground level, directly below the beam, resting on its side, the curved surface catching the light from below. I walked back to the staircase and descended. Each step producing a hollow metallic echo. I reached the ground level and approached the helmet, bent down and lifted it. The surface showed no moisture, no cracks. The scratches visible under the light. I rotated it slowly in my hands. The inside band darkened from use, the plastic edge rough in one section near the back. Then I placed it on a stack of wooden boards nearby. Higher than the floor, the edges of the boards uneven, splinters visible along the sides. I stepped back and looked up at the beam above, the bar still empty. I turned away and walked toward the rear section of the building, where fewer lights were installed. The illumination weaker, shadows deeper between the columns. I passed through that area, checking the perimeter panels, temporary sheets fixed over the openings, secured with screws, no displacement, no gaps. I turned back toward the central structure, and as I walked, another metallic sound came from behind me. A sharp impact followed by a brief vibration, echoing across the space. I turned immediately. The area behind me unchanged. Stacks of materials, cables hanging, no movement. I walked back toward the central section, step by step, until I reached the same position again and stopped. The stack of boards where I had placed the helmet was empty. I looked across the floor, scanning the entire area, and then I saw it. The helmet was back on the beam, in the same position as before, balanced on the metal bar, aligned with the edge. I walked toward the staircase again, climbed up to the second level, and approached the beam, the helmet in place, no movement. I reached out, took it, and placed it on the platform floor. Closer to the wall, away from the beam, I stepped back and kept it in view, the surrounding area unchanged, no shifting shadows, no sound. I turned my head briefly to check the opposite side of the platform, and when I looked back, the helmet was no longer on the floor. I moved quickly to the edge of the platform and looked down. The helmet was on the ground level again, directly below the beam, in the same position as before. I went back down the staircase, reached the floor, and stopped next to it. The object resting on its side, I did not pick it up again. I walked past it and continued toward the middle of the building, where several suspended cables hung over an open shaft. And while I crossed that section, another sound came from above. 2 short metal knocks, separated by a pause, then one longer scrape, the echo traveling from one side of the structure to the other. Bouncing off the concrete and steel, I looked up at the unfinished ceiling, the temporary lights, the bars crossing over the void, then turned toward the sound and followed it to the far side of the level, where a wheelbarrow stood beside a column and a cluster of hand tools had been left on a sheet of plywood, a wrench, a trowel, a rusted clamp, and a second helmet hanging from a bent hook, darker in color. Coated in dust, I stood there for a moment. Then, Another metallic impact came from the direction of the temporary office, near the entrance, shorter this time, but clear enough to cut through the open space. I turned and walked toward it, passing the same rows of materials, the same columns, the same loose boards under the lights. I stepped inside the office and closed the door behind me. The sound outside reduced, the interior lit by a single bulb hanging from a cable, a desk positioned against the wall, papers stacked in folders, clipboards arranged in uneven piles, a thermos without a lid near the corner, 2 cracked mugs, a tape dispenser, a box of screws left open. I walked to the desk and looked down at the documents, inspection reports with stamped marks, delivery notes with handwritten numbers, safety checklists with marked boxes, and a printed list of workers assigned to the project. I picked up the list and laid it flat on the desk. Rows of printed names aligned in columns, each one followed by a roll and an identification number. The paper slightly curled at the edges, dust settled along the top margin, a date printed at the top, a second date stamped near the lower corner, and several signatures crossing the bottom line in dark ink. I moved down the list slowly, reading each line, until I reached the lower section and stopped. My name was there, printed in the same format, aligned with the others, the roll matching my current position, the page dated prior to the project stop date. I kept the sheet flat on the desk and looked at the line again, then at the signatures below it, one of them crossing partly into the margin. The ink faded in one section, darker in another. I placed the paper back on the desk and reached for another folder beside it, opening it to reveal accident forms, shift records, copies of site access logs, and another worker list underneath, older paper. Darker edges, holes punched along one side. I turned one page, then another, the same project name repeating at the top, the same site address, the same stamped code. And before I reached the end of the folder, another metallic sound came from outside. A short impact, followed by a dragging noise across a surface, echoing through the structure. I closed the folder, opened the door, and stepped out. The central area visible ahead, the columns, the beams, the scattered materials. I walked slowly toward the center, looked up at the second level, and the helmet was there again, on the beam, in the same position, aligned with the edge. No movement, no vibration, no sound. Story 3. I went to a 24-hour laundromat late at night because it was empty at that hour, the place lit by long fluorescent tubes fixed to the ceiling, a steady white light reflecting off white and blue tiles. The floor slightly wet in some areas, thin lines of water running toward a drain near the wall. Rows of washing machines aligned along both sides, metal doors with circular glass windows, scratched surfaces, faded instruction labels, coin slots worn from use, a row of dryers opposite, larger doors, dark interiors, a vending machine near the entrance with flickering numbers, and a plastic chair beside it. I carried a bag of clothes, placed it on a folding table made of metal, the surface cold and slightly uneven, and loaded one of the machines, pushing each piece inside one by one. Light shirts, darker pants, socks, all visible through the open door. I closed it, inserted coins, pressed the start button, and the drum began to rotate slowly, water filling the bottom, foam forming along the edges, the sound of the motor steady, a low continuous vibration spreading through the metal casing. I stepped back and sat on the plastic chair. The sound of the machine repeating in a constant rhythm, echoing slightly against the tiled walls. I watched the clothes turning behind the glass, colors shifting as they moved, fabric pressing against the surface and sliding away again. After a few minutes, the cycle stopped, the drum still, the light above reflecting on the wet glass. I stood up, walked over, and opened the door. The clothes inside were not the same as before. Additional items mixed with mine, darker fabric, thicker material, heavier pieces filling the drum. I reached inside and pulled one out, a shirt, the fabric rough, seams visible along the sides. The item was not in my bag. I placed it on the table and removed the rest of the load, separating my clothes from the others, laying them out in 2 piles. The unknown pieces different in texture and weight, some long sleeves, some thicker layers, all damp from the same cycle. I checked the inside of the drum, empty, no fabric left. I picked up my clothes and moved them into a dryer, closed the door, inserted coins, and pressed start. The drum spinning faster, warm air circulating inside, the sound louder than before, a hollow rotating noise mixed with the movement of fabric. I stepped back again and watched the rotation, my clothes visible through the glass. Moving in a continuous pattern, I turned away for a moment, looked toward the vending machine, the display flickering, a soft buzzing sound coming from inside. Then I looked back at the dryer, and there were more items inside than before. Additional fabric mixed with mine, shapes different. Some folded tightly, others stretched along the surface. I waited for the cycle to finish, then opened the dryer, warm air escaping into the room. I reached in and pulled out the clothes, placing them on the table, again separating my items from the others, the unknown pieces still present. Dry now, lighter, edges slightly wrinkled. I picked up one of them and checked the pockets, sliding my fingers inside, and touched something flat. I pulled it out, a small photograph. The surface slightly bent, edges worn. I held it under the light, the image showing a room, a bed positioned against a wall, a person lying on it, the angle low, close to the floor, the figure visible from the side. I placed the photo on the table and continued removing the rest of the clothes, checking each pocket, finding nothing else. I gathered my clothes and folded them, stacking them into a neat pile, then placed them back into my bag, leaving the unknown items on the table. I turned toward the machines again, the row of washers silent, doors closed, no movement. I walked along them slowly, checking each one, the glass reflecting the fluorescent lights, the metal surfaces scratched and dull. I stopped at the machine I had used and looked through the glass. The drum empty, the interior still. I turned back toward the table and picked up the photo again, holding it closer under the light, the image clearer, the person on the bed visible in more detail, the clothing visible, the same as my own, the position unchanged, the room identical to mine, the bed frame, the wall, the angle of the shot fixed near the floor. I placed the photo back on the table and stood still, then turned toward the dryers again, one of them active, the drum rotating, clothes inside moving rapidly. The machine was off, before, now running. I walked toward it, stopped in front of the glass, and watched the contents turning, several pieces inside, darker, heavier. I waited until the cycle slowed and stopped, then opened the door, reached inside, and pulled out the clothes, placing them on the table, checking each one. Empty pockets, no objects. I lifted one piece, shook it slightly, and a second photograph fell out. Sliding across the surface, I picked it up and looked at it under the light. The same room again, the same bed, the same person, the same position. The angle slightly higher this time. Closer to the side of the bed, more of the wall visible. I placed it next to the first one and looked at both images, then turned toward the entrance. The glass door still closed, the street outside empty. No movement. I looked back at the machines, all silent again. No rotation, no sound except a faint electrical buzz from the lights above. I gathered the photographs and placed them together on the table, one beside the other, and reached for my bag. I lifted it slightly, and another piece was there inside, darker fabric, folded tightly between my clothes. The item was not there before. I took it out and placed it on the table, unfolded it. The material thick, seams reinforced. I checked the pockets, sliding my fingers inside, and touched something flat again. I pulled it out. Another photograph. I held it under the light, the same room. the same bed, the same person, the same position, the angle lower this time, aligned with the floor near the side of the bed. As I placed it next to the others, 3 images forming a sequence, each taken from a different position, all showing the same scene. I looked at them, then at the machines, then back at the table. And the laundromat remained silent, the lights steady, the machines still, the tiles reflecting the white light, no movement anywhere inside the room. If you made it this far, you already know something here wasn't right. So tell me in the comments, which story stayed with you the most? And if you've ever seen something move when it wasn't supposed to, write it down, because I read everything. Subscribe to Tales of the Darkness and turn on notifications, because the next story might feel even closer than this one. /Tave, a beg. And if you're watching this alone right now, take a second, look around, just in case something isn't where you left it.